The Spin-off Podcast Network. Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today.
The Fold is brought to you by O-Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. No mai, hoki mai kia The Fold, ko Duncan Grieve tōku ingoa. My guest this week is Jon Duffy, who, and this happens periodically on this show, right? You're like, is this a media organisation? He represents Consumer New Zealand, formerly known as the Consumers Institute, which was founded in 1959 as I think it was essentially part of government or certainly was state funded to sort of advance the interests of consumers, provide a degree of protection for the little guy against big business and government, and it essentially kind of during the great sort of purge of the fourth Labour government, it lost its government funding and flipped and became a member-funded organisation, and the core of that product was a magazine, and I think it's a really interesting organisation in that it's part kind of product reviews, and it has a really robust process around that, which you can surface online or be delivered to you in your magazine. So it'll just help you buy a better leaf blower or washing machine. But it also has this kind of bigger mission, which is essentially around just protecting consumers from all kinds of different elements of sort of market failure. Ultimately, the most prominent recently has been its taking of the Commerce Commission's report into the supermarket, the grocery industry, and really making it. I felt like Jon and his team have really driven the conversation that has made us understand. We've always sort of known that food is expensive here, but the story that gets told is we're a long way from anywhere. We're a small market. There are lots of reasons for it, but really one of the key ones. I mean, those things are true, but the study revealed, and certainly consumers' advocacy has made it clear that that's about excess profit taking. That were we to have true competition here, we'd be paying significantly less for groceries. And he talks about that study and their response to it, and what I think has been a step change in how we think about about the supermarket duopoly over the past couple of years, and I think that basically kind of speaks to what makes consumer really interesting as an organisation, that it's sort of half in the media, it's half in advocacy. It has this, he doesn't give it a precise number, but they have 50,000 or so subscribers, and that would make it one of the most highly subscribed to publications in the country, and that's part of what gives it. Enables it to fulfil its mandate, and I think Jon he's a super smart, super principled guy. He's a lawyer by training, and I think the country really benefits from having an organisation like Consumer out there, kind of essentially as a check or a balance or a test against a lot of what we sort of we consume and deal with as consumers in this country. So it's a really interesting conversation, I think, and takes in all the complexity of that organisation and this particular moment in business. So this is Jon Duffy, CEO of Consumer New Zealand, on The Fold. Tēnā koe, John, and welcome to the fold.
Thanks a lot. Good to be here.
So I wonder if you could start by explaining what Consumer is, because it's a relatively unique organisation, and it's in some ways it's part of the media, in some ways it has all these other functions as well. So just explain for our audience your vision of Consumer.
Yeah, we are a bit of a weird beast. So, primarily we're an advocacy and research organisation, but we're probably best known, perhaps by an older generation, for the key artefact that we produce, which is Consumer magazine. So we've over the years, crept into the media space, and we do investigative reporting, and as well as research into topics that relate to consumer welfare and other consumer-related issues. Definitely from one angle, you can look at us and say we're part of the mainstream media. What's unique about us, I guess, is we rely on our members who subscribe to us for the bulk of our funding. So, as part of the rules that set us up as a charity, we don't take advertising because it would compromise our independence. So that's a really core value that we hold, and that makes us different from many in the mainstream media. Where the business model relies on the ability to take in advertising. It'd be really nice to be able to take in advertising at times, and we do get approached, but we have to politely decline. And I see that funding sail off down the road.
Totally. Just before we get into Consumer, because I think there are so many threads to pull on there in terms of it, that sort of liminal space it occupies. But how did you? What's your sort of backstory in terms of going to it, and what was it about the role that attracted you to it?
Well, it's always been on my radar. So I trained as a lawyer, and back when I was at university, David Russell was the CEO of Consumer, and he was always in the news, always advocating for the little guy against the big corporates. And maybe that planted a seed. Always kind of thought, wow, that's a cool dude. I'd like to be like him one day, as a kid. And my first job out of university was I fell into an investigative role at the Commerce Commission and stayed there for quite a while, investigating, corporates doing bad things and misleading consumers, and really loved the work. And that's kind of the career I've followed from there. Most recently, I was the Assistant Privacy Commissioner, so kind of branched out into privacy, which is really a form of consumer protection as well. And that's kind of landed me here. So
in terms of that member funding model, I saw a report somewhere that suggested you had 100,000 members in 2016. Is that accurate, or can you provide do you make public the current sort of situation?
That wouldn't be members. That would be what we call supporters. So that's not necessarily someone who's paying us money to subscribe to get behind our paywall or purchase the magazine. That is someone who's, signed up to receive information from us, or might have made a donation or answered a survey or something like that. We're probably more accurately around half that in terms of paying members.
Which is still pretty extraordinary when you think about, the Herald recently celebrated 100,000 digital subscribers. That's to probably the most prominent daily newspaper in the country, and Consumer off to one side, obviously a completely different business model, but it's relatively low profile in some respects, certainly the sort of media aspect of it. But to have such a, that would put you very high up in terms of if you were to think of it as a magazine. Do you, does that provide enough to do all that you to sort of fulfill that scope, and is it stable? How are you tracking?
Yeah, those are great questions. So, short answer, no, it doesn't provide enough. So we have to diversify our income streams, and it's declining. So we have a very loyal subscriber base, but they skew older, and particularly in times like these, when people might be retired and on fixed incomes, and the price of doing anything is increasing. people go, well, what spend can I justify? What spend can't I? And, we get lots of emails from our members going, oh, look, I've supported you for 30 years, love to stick around, but actually I've got to put food on the table, I've got to pay the power bill or whatever it is. And that's fine. People stay on as a supporter and stay in touch with us, but they're just not paying us money. So we need to grow other revenue streams to keep doing what we're doing. And, that's not easy. We're out there like many other charities in New Zealand trying to find money to do good things to help people. And, particularly in the current economic climate, it's challenging.
I guess there's an irony or a tension in that, like, a moment like this, people sort of need, there's extreme vulnerability in a high inflation environment, the advocacy work that you do and that sort of watchdog element of your work is more necessary than ever, but at the same time the squeeze is on to finances, which is the thing that you need to scrutinise. You can see how that's a pretty tense situation. Has there ever been or any thought to, because historically the Consumers Institute was government funded before it was sort of liberated from that by the fourth Labour government.
Depending on your point of view.
Yeah. Would you, and it's sort of not completely dissimilar to things like the Drug Foundation or these other kind of not-for-profit, quasi, sort of NGO type institutions that the country sort of needs to operate, but this one just happens to not have that kind of stable funding. Have you sort of thought to or approached the government about rekindling that? So
we do work with government on ad hoc projects, right? So people might be familiar with the sunscreen testing that we do every year, and we've had a long-running campaign to get better regulation around sunscreen in New Zealand. Well, the Ministry of Health provide us with some seed funding to support some of that testing every year. So that's an example of some government funding, but it's very project-specific. There's no general fund that says go out there and advocate for consumers. And that's actually increasingly problematic, particularly under this government, where there's been a really ambitious program of consumer-related law reform, which has kept officials up at night sweating, and policy shops, particularly places like MB and Ministry for the Environment, various other places, are working extremely hard and producing huge amounts of work, and we will then be approached saying, "Hey, can you provide a consumer lens to this piece of work, this 120-page white paper on quite a niche issue? Can you please contribute to this?" And we have a small team, and the grim reality is we need to prioritise what we can invest our resource in, and sometimes important work has to fall by the wayside because it's trumped by other work, and that's really regrettable because a genuine independent consumer voice is then not brought into the submission process, which can then subsequently result in bad law.
Yeah, I can imagine that. I mean, for all that you have, it has felt like, consumers always been part of the national conversation, but I feel like over the past couple of years since you've taken over, you can just sort of really hear it. And I think the supermarket conversation, which no one's ever loved the duopoly or any kind of a duopoly, but the sort of, it feels like the public understanding of what we deal with from their role in our sort of food supply chain has been reframed in quite a radical and it feels like a long-lasting way, and that there will be kind of legislative change as a result. Do you want to talk about that campaign, about what animated it and how you think it's gone?
Well, it's been a real journey, and it hasn't been a particularly easy one, but for many years, Consumer NZ has been sitting here going, there's something wrong here. For 20 years, literally since the duopoly formed, when the last, the last third, I think it was Foodtown, was gobbled up by Progressive, which then became Woolworths, forming a duopoly. things have progressively been going poorly for consumers and actually suppliers, with the duopoly sitting in the middle, able to clip the ticket at both ends. And, we pushed and pushed and pushed for regulation. Finally, this government relented and said, okay, we'll get the Commerce Commission to do a market study, which was a great result. The Commerce Commission did a very, very good piece of work and formed an evidence base, which meant organisations like us or like the Food and Grocery Council could then go, okay, an independent body's gone out and they've established this and it's robust in economic terms. Actually, yeah, we have been being ripped off for a number of years and there's a profitability measure that the supermarkets debate, but it's out there. It's, $1 million plus a day, at least at the point in time the Commission released its findings. And I think boiling what is quite a complex competition issue down to simple metrics like these guys are able to do this and able to profit to this extent, $1 million a day that New Zealanders shouldn't be paying, because
that's an excess profit, right? Like I feel like sometimes people are like, oh, that's a big number, and then you look at the bank's profitability and it sort of seems to dwarf it. But these are sort of excess profits that beyond what would happen in any kind of similar market.
In a genuinely competitive market, and that really simplified it for people, I think. And we finally had I guess not vindication, but we had like a clear bit of evidence. We could go, well, that funkiness that we were pointing to for the last 20 years, actually it's true. And here's what we think you should do about it. And that meant the conversation could move on to solutions, because there was no argument that there was something going wrong anymore, that we'd moved beyond that. And it's very interesting to see the response of the supermarkets. I think certainly Woolworths, that owns Countdown, have been through this in Australia. So they've been, I think, much more approachable and welcoming is the wrong word, but amenable to the changes that need to be made, whereas foodstuffs, from my perspective, are probably still going, well, we might be able to fight this, or we can minimise what we need to do to the greatest extent. And I think we're past that. I think actually, given what's happening in society at the moment, supermarkets certainly have played a role in what we're experiencing now with the cost of living. It's not necessarily exclusively their fault, but they have contributed to it, and they need to face up to that, in my opinion.
Are you confident that now that we have moved on to this next stage of the conversation, and it is more of a regulatory response era rather than that sort of ineffable kind of can we diagnose the problem, that that the meaningful change is going to come? I was just texted an image from my wife of 6 long cheese rolls at Countdown for $6.20, which vibes like a near tripling of a plausible price from like 5 years ago. Just one data point, and we're all surrounded by it all the time. So, because you can, on one hand, yes, Countdown have been more sort of open with this. That there's discussion about the sort of decoupling of wholesale from retail or creating access there, bringing a third party in. It still feels sort of vulnerable to our term cycles and just the vagaries of politics. How confident are you that one day that excess profit will come down and have a meaningful benefit to New Zealand consumers?
Well, I think the only thing that's really going to change the duopoly's ability to do what they're doing is a new entrant coming into the market. And we've seen already, I think RNZ did a study that we commented on around the Costco effect, with Costco opening in Auckland. There's some pack and saves around that region of Auckland, and comparable prices, they've changed when compared to other pack and saves. So there's an immediate impact that competition brings. And what the government's doing, the pathway that they've laid out, is moving some of those big roadblocks out of the way so that the market can do good things that markets do when they work right, and that's put competitive pressure on the participants in that market to lower prices. And, that's all we really want. We're not looking for anyone to be punished or scapegoated or anything like that. We just want a fair deal for New Zealanders. And at the moment, the market conditions rely on the benevolence of the duopoly. They don't. There's no big stick, whether it's natural market forces or regulation. But the pathway that the government's on, there's no perfect solution here. It's always going to be really messy because you're unwinding 20 years of duopoly power, and with all the best public will expressed, profit-making entities naturally don't want to give up profit, right? That's really an anathema to why they exist. So without good regulation, nothing's going to change. So good regulation should lead to new entry, and new entry should lead to better competition and better prices and better service, actually, because that's the other thing that the Commerce Commission's inquiry highlighted. The supermarkets we have in New Zealand, and you just need to go overseas and shop elsewhere, in terms of, the technology that's deployed in supermarkets, range, all that sort of stuff, we're a long way behind. And in fact, things have got worse in the last year in terms of range, as you just need to go to a foodstuff supermarket and note the prevalence of home brands at the expense of other competing brands. Sure, foodstuffs have done what's the one called, the price rollback or price freeze, one or the other, and are offering better prices, but those are predominantly on their home brands, right? And let's remember, they're saying, hey, supply costs have gone up, that's why things are getting more expensive. Well, they're actually the supplier in those examples, right? They control most of the supply chain right through to your shopping baskets. So they're clipping the ticket everywhere.
Do you see another sector, or when you're looking at your sort of bodies of work, which are invariably complex undertakings, and you have to be choosy, what sort of, where are you going next, and what's the sort of the process around, like, it's a very different media environment to the one in which, the Consumers Institute historically operated. Is sort of campaigning different now?
Oh, absolutely. And we've, I've spent a lot of my time as CEO kind of beefing up our ability to run campaigns. And I have an amazing campaigns and advocacy team led by Gemma Rasmussen, and her team are weapons. They are innovative. They are creative in how they campaign, but at their core, they are all about the consumer and consumer welfare. And you can see them visibly get angry when emails come in describing a situation where a consumer's at the wrong end of the stick in terms of relationship with a business. And it's very, if you could bottle that passion, it would be an expensive bottle. It's really. I'm very, very, very blessed to have such a passionate and committed team. So, I think in some ways it is much tougher for us now because we have fewer subscribers. We're growing us, and as we grow our supporters, we're growing a younger demographic in that supporter group. But people don't subscribe to magazines like they used to, right? It's quite a niche purchase. So, the magazine, while it's dear to our hearts and prominent in our legacy, it's simply another channel for us to communicate with people, to help raise their awareness or help advocate for a certain cause. So we run our own podcast now, for example, as well as the magazine. Our website is by far our most trafficked channel of all, and in terms of advocacy, we're out there. We've tried to up our media presence and our public appearances, that sort of thing. So we're out talking to people, we're engaging with people, and we're all the time we're doing that. We're bringing in information about what consumers are thinking. When we've upped our regular surveying of consumer sentiment, so that we can genuinely say we've got our finger on the pulse of where consumers are in New Zealand.
Yeah, you've gone through a digital transition, like that sort of online consumer reports space is really interesting. I look at what the New York Times has done with Wirecutter, since they acquired it. in the affiliate marketing space, yet the sort of are you allowed to participate in affiliate marketing, or is that sort of contra your sort of charitable status?
Yeah, it could potentially compromise our independence as well. So we have to be really, really, really guarded around our independence. And probably one of the more interesting areas we're in, when we review a product, we might say, hey, this is the best, I don't know, vacuum cleaner on the market. And so we'll say, consumer recommends this. And if it's a certain brand, we can be approached by that brand, or we'll approach that brand and say, hey, if you want to advertise the fact that you are the consumer recommended brand this year, you can do that, and we'll license you the ability to use our logo. And that's a small, but it's a revenue stream as well. But there are people who have a level of discomfort with that. I'm at peace with it because I can see that brands are out there fighting for that endorsement, and they're getting better as they do that. So, there's an obvious consumer payoff there, but the line of sight of that consumer payoff is not completely visible to everybody.
The Fold is brought to you by oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to oOh!media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
Skinny are helping you show how smart you are with the 1Q quiz, an all-new, super challenging and super quick daily quiz built by the Spin-Off. Every Monday, Skinny are giving you the chance to prove you're smart with the Skinny Extra Credit question. Get it right, and you'll get the chance to score yourself some Skinny Extra mobile credit, so you can text, call, or even video call your group chat and gloat about how big your brain is. T's and C's apply.
You recently got into a bit of a dispute with Electric Kiwi over your Power Switch brand, and which is another sort of, again, of these kind of long tail of other revenue streams, which where as I understand it, you ask that a brand pay $50 if a consumer ends up switching as a result of engagement with that product. Which, Electric Kiwi saw that as, on some level, the fact that they have to agree to those terms to appear in this, in this product, as kind of contra the sort of the kind of mission that you've been talking about. How do you justify that in that space where you are quite where you operate quite differently, or seemingly there's a lot of reticence about engaging in that way in others?
That has been a really tricky issue for us to deal with, because there's been a lot of misinformation coming out of Electric Kiwi, unfortunately, and we've obviously contacted them and corrected them. Some of the factually incorrect statements that they were making. So, to be completely clear, the Electricity Authority funds around about 75% of Power Switch. And that funding is allocated, is paid by a levy by electricity companies. And that is allocated based on how many connections a company has. So the big companies like Contact and Meridian and Mercury, they play the lion's share of that funding. So for Electric Kiwi to come out and say that they're paying the lion's share of a Power Switch funding is blatantly incorrect. There are the 25% that the EA don't fund is funded through switching fees, and that is a model that has been agreed with the Electricity Authority, and it's effectively a user pays model, which says the company that a consumer chooses to switch to should pay for the benefit of this site being up and running and available to consumers. And it's a very modest fee compared to what commercial entities charge, and the bulk of the industry are more than happy to pay it. Electric Kiwi has raised concerns, and they're very much entitled to their opinion. Unfortunately, the way they've raised those concerns has been quite misleading, in my opinion. And over the kind of the length of the relationship with Electric Kiwi has really made it problematic for PowerSwitch to cover its own expenses, and a decision had to be made if Electric Kiwi was insisting on being treated differently to every other player in the industry that was participating in PowerSwitch. Well, that really wasn't fair to the rest of the industry. Electric Kiwi shouldn't be allowed to free ride on what the rest of the industry was doing. So a decision was made to say, if you're not willing to comply with the terms, then unfortunately we won't be able to offer you the service, and that's the decision that's been made.
Do you feel like the construction of that particular product in terms of that 75-25 split is optimal in terms of the way that it interacts with what is more typical for a consumer-run product?
Look, the reality is we were on the public record as saying we would much prefer PowerSwitch to be 100% funded.
Right.
The electricity price review that came out in 2019, that was their recommendation. The minister made a recommendation to that effect coming out of that review. We support that recommendation. However, that's not the decision that our majority funder has gone with, and we need to make the best of the situation, because if PowerSwitch wasn't there, consumers would be detrimental to consumers. So, not wanting to dodge away from the question, but the average saving that we're seeing consumers make on an annual basis on PowerSwitch is $385 if they switch to another provider. That's extrapolated out across the population, or the connections in the population. That's a huge amount of money that consumers are currently leaving on the table, because we certainly are only seeing a small percentage of the population switching. So if we can get more people using the website and switching to the right provider, there's a huge consumer benefit there. So we wouldn't want to see it fall over because one company objects to the funding model that is necessary to keep it running.
I mean, on some level, a $385 annual saving to another company that is ultimately also a for-profit and can clearly continue to operate at that level does point to some of those fundamental issues that have long been touted in terms of the sort of gentailer model within power. Is that sort of next up, or I asked earlier and then went off somewhere else, but where would you see, like, having really kind of kickstarted that conversation around supermarkets, if you only had one choice in terms of where you could do the most good by approaching a sector and sort of really having this country understand the way it interacts with its consumer base, where would you go?
It's a really interesting question. I think there are issues in the electricity market that are not being addressed at the moment. And as we decarbonise the economy, we are heavily reliant on the electricity sector. And the question becomes, should consumers bear the burden of all the investment that's going to need to go into that sector, which has, some of which is catch-up investment. So if we look at, some of the lines infrastructure, not necessarily looking at the gentailers. I mean, people may not be familiar with the kind of Frankenstein nature of the market structure, but there's kind of 4 components to it: generation, transmission, which is the big power pylons that are run by Transpower; distribution, which is your local lines company; and then retail, which is, it's complicated by the fact that retail is actually sometimes owned by the generators, so they're called gentailers, and then there's sometimes they're independent companies like Flick or someone like that. And so, or Electric Kiwi, I should mention that they're independent as well. And it's important that retail market is made up of companies who compete with the generators and the big gentailers, because it does that good stuff that we talked about when we're talking about supermarkets, right? It brings in innovation and better customer service, because those independent players, they still need to buy generation off the gentailers, right? Off the generators. And they've got to differentiate themselves from them, and they've got to be lean because, there is the potential ability for the generators to cross-subsidise and prop up unprofitable retail arms with the profits that they're making the gentail arms. Not necessarily saying I have evidence that is happening, but it has long been a discussion point in the industry. So I think there are certainly issues that we will need to address from a consumer perspective, because the investment that we need both in new generation and the ability to get power to people is going to require lots of money. And if the market's not operating effectively, consumers could bear a disproportionately high portion of that. I think it's inevitable that power prices are going to go up, though. In fact, we're already seeing that. And it is pretty tough for some people, which is again why, shameless plug, get onto Power Switch and check that you're on the right plan, because you could be saving some coin. So electricity, I think, banking is often touted as a sector that's got a similar funk about it in New Zealand.
Yeah.
And, we've got majority Australian-owned giants, and profitability is an issue. So whether the Commerce Commission would be keeping a wary eye on that sector for a market study, I don't know. The sector dodged a commission of inquiry, a Royal Commission, unlike the sector in Australia, which was subject to a Royal Commission, and that had some pretty interesting findings. And let's remember that the majority of the players in the Australian market are players in the New Zealand market, albeit under New Zealand-friendly brands. So that could be another sector that's potentially worth looking at.
Well, one sector which, I talk about a lot on this podcast, I think about it, write about a lot, because it is, at least with electricity, with groceries, with banking, there are nominally regulators or there's a framework in which they operate. With technology, it still remains almost entirely unimagined. I know you did some work on this at the Privacy Commission, and it is kind of listed as, albeit under the sort of data umbrella as something there which is of interest to you. But I sort of think about consumers of traditional media who are quite well protected through institutions like the Advertising Standards Authority, the Broadcasting Standards Authority, and the Media Council. And then you have the now far larger, far more profitable, far more attention, and ultimately far younger in terms of the various profiles of the audiences that come through the various sort of social and search platforms, where you've seen places like the EU point to phenomenally anti-competitive behaviour by the likes of Google and Amazon in terms of the way they privilege and present information. That's also the reason why the whole world has been slow on this is it's moved very fast in terms of the technology and consumer behaviour, and also it's ferociously complicated, almost by design in some respects. Do you look at that and go, I'd like to get into that, or is it just too big, too scary, and harder to connect to your sort of core abilities?
It's not beyond our resources to comment on, but it is, let's be frank, it's beyond the resources of the New Zealand government to do anything about. Let's be honest here, this is enormous. I mean, the Australians have come out and looked at fair compensation for media organisations when their content is reposted on social media. I think that is a great thing that the Australians have done. But, New Zealand is a rounding error on Facebook's overall profitability. If I think back to my Privacy Commission days and, when the Privacy Commissioner, John Edwards at the time, gave Facebook a serve for its lacklustre approach to getting rid of footage of the March 15, the Christchurch massacre. We kind of looked at it at the time and went, well, if push came to shove and the government really, really wanted to take action, would Facebook even really care other than the potential domino effect into other jurisdictions? It wouldn't necessarily be worried too much if, Facebook and Instagram and its various other interests in New Zealand got turned off because we're a very insignificant part of its overall business. So on one level, yeah, it's actually frightening that these companies have got so big and have so much scale and are so entwined in not only our personal lives, but the marketing strategies, the profitability of many companies, right? And many government departments, are avid users of social media, and the government's Facebook bill or Instagram bill. I wonder what that is. It'd be probably hundreds of millions of dollars a year. So unraveling that is just a hugely complex issue, and unfortunately, it is really detrimental to, I guess, the robustness of our media landscape. And, there's some really interesting comments in the Stuff Me merger decision a few years back where the Commerce Commission used a competition analysis to look at the media's role in our democracy and, concluded there needs to be a plurality of opinions in the media landscape. If we allow mergers, they didn't say this, but, use the supermarket industry as a really good example where you merge down to duopoly or even monopoly. There is a loss of dynamism there that is really detrimental. And when you're talking about the media, it actually has a broader impact on society and a democracy.
I mean, the thing that's interesting to me about that is, when things are consolidating into a position, we have competition laws and they can be assessed if they reach a sufficient scale. Where you have sort of found monopolies, I think of search particularly, where that is search is the scale of it in terms of it's effectively a utility. There is one provider, and it has flow-on impacts into commerce. Into all other, people call it digital rent, and quite often, for example, a Spark might rent its own name from a search list its competitor rent the top position there, which again seems like anti-consumer. If you search for a particular provider, the top result feels like it should be that provider, and the whole way that is structured just again, this isn't new now. We're sort of 20 years into sort of a mass adoption internet, and there doesn't seem to be any major push to try and put in any guardrails at all. It feels to me like the consumer protections that we enjoy with physical world transactions and services they're in no way replicated when we take that to the digital sphere. But I agree that the prospect of actually wrapping your arms around it and figuring out how to create a body of work out of something where fundamentally all of the work happens thousands of miles away in different jurisdictions, and setting aside the whole tax part of it too.
Yeah, I think that's right. It is quite daunting, and a way into it that I often think about is the strength of our privacy laws and this concept of consent that basically all e-commerce, all social media is based on, right? We tick that we've read the terms and conditions and we're deemed to have consented to our data being used in certain ways. And look, no one does. Let's be blunt about that. No one sits down and reads their agreement with Apple or Google or whatever the example might be. And
you almost have, like, your phone doesn't really work if you don't consent.
Well, precisely. It's a take it or leave it deal, right?
Yeah.
Also, so the question becomes: do you participate in society, or do you, you buy a batch in Takakura, put a tinfoil hat on, and just and hide away from society? And that lifestyle is quite tempting on some occasions, but and particularly as more government services digitise, you realistically don't have the option of opting out, and you don't have the option of negotiating. But looking at our privacy laws, there is a way there potentially, if there is a will, to actually argue when a dispute arises, hey, I don't know, Instagram, you have the ability to track everything I do when I sign up to your website. You know that I didn't read the terms and conditions and scroll through them, or if I did, I didn't scroll through them to the end. You know this.
It's not true informed consent.
It's not genuine, yeah. So to then turn around and say, we're relying on these terms and conditions that you consented to, it's a fallacy. It's a fallacy that the internet's been built on. It's all based on a piece of California legislation that kind of opened the floodgates, and we're all, 15, 20 years ago, and we're all dealing with the consequences now.
Well, I applaud the work that you've done so far, and it's great to hear someone in your position acknowledging those tensions and pointing a way forward. Hopefully, if the lawyer in you must quite like the idea of using that privacy law to challenge some of these seemingly immutable kind of realities that we live with, but perhaps for next year or beyond. But thank you so much for making time for us, Jon. And actually, feel free if you don't mind to plug your own podcast, because I love the idea of that.
Oh, sure. Look, we run a podcast here called Consume This. Myself and my co-host Sophie Richardson talk about all sorts of issues. We talked at on the data side, we looked at a worm farm purchase that my co-host Sophie made based on an Instagram ad, and we tracked back through to the worm farm company how they had targeted Sophie, and it's a really, really interesting yarn. So hop onto your usual podcast channel and look up Consume This, and you'll find us. There's a couple of seasons there.
Sounds fascinating. Thanks so much, Jon, and have a great day.
Awesome. You too. Thank you.
The Fold was brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network. It was hosted by Duncan Grieve, produced by T.I. He Butler, with production management by Rachel LaRue and series production by Jane Yee.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Kia ora e te iwi, T.I. He Butler here, podcast manager at The Spin-Off. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spin-Off member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. The Spin-Off Podcast Network.